When we think about money today, we imagine banks, salaries, digital payments, and markets. We think of checking accounts, credit cards, stock portfolios, paychecks deposited every 2 weeks. But for most of human history, none of this existed. There were no central banks, no modern currencies, no financial institutions as we know them, no ATMs, no wire transfers, no corporations paying dividends. And yet, enormous wealth was created, empires were funded, trade connected continents. The Roman Empire commanded resources across 3 continents. The Silk Road moved luxury goods across Asia and Europe. Medieval kingdoms built cathedrals that took centuries to complete. So how did money actually work before modern capitalism? How did people get rich? How were taxes collected? How did trade function without modern finance? To answer that, we need to look past modern ideas of money and understand what it truly was. Before modern capitalism, money wasn't a single object. It wasn't always coins. It wasn't always precious metal. Money was anything society agreed could store value and facilitate exchange. In different places and different times, that meant gold, silver, grain, salt, livestock, land, or even labor obligations. In ancient Mesopotamia, barley was money. Wages were calculated in barley. Debts were recorded in barley. In Rome, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. That's where we get the word salary, from salarium, the salt allowance. In medieval Europe, land itself functioned as wealth. Owning land meant owning the right to extract value from those who worked it. In some African societies, cowrie shells circulated as currency for centuries. What mattered wasn't the object itself, but trust. If people accepted it in exchange, if it was recognized as valuable, if it could be stored and transferred, it functioned as money. This is important to understand because it reveals something fundamental. Money is social agreement, not material fact. Gold isn't inherently valuable. We agree it's valuable. Paper currency isn't inherently worth anything. We trust the institution behind it. Before modern capitalism, that social agreement looked very different. Wealth at this time was physical. You could see it, measure it, and store it. A wealthy person's riches were visible: grain and storage, herds of animals, chests of silver. Wealth was concrete, not abstract. You couldn't hold wealth in a bank account you'd never see. You held it in your hands or in warehouses you controlled. This physicality shaped everything about how economies functioned. Before capitalism, wealth did not come from wages or salaries in the way we understand them today. You didn't get rich by working for someone else and saving your paycheck. Wealth came from control. Control of land meant control of food, and food was the foundation of everything. If you controlled farmland, you controlled the farmers. You took a portion of their harvest as rent or tax. That portion fed you, your household, your soldiers, your administrators. You didn't need to farm, you just needed to own. Control of trade routes meant control of prices. If goods had to pass through your territory, you could charge tolls, you could tax merchants, you could regulate who traded and who didn't. The wealth didn't come from producing anything, it came from occupying a strategic position. Control of ports meant control of access to entire regions. A port city could tax every ship that docked, every merchant who unloaded goods, every transaction that took place within its walls. Venice became one of the richest cities in medieval Europe not because it produced much, but because it controlled access between East and West. This is why wealth concentrated so heavily. If wealth comes from control, and control is won through force, inheritance, or political favor, then most people can never access it. A peasant farmer could work every day of his life and never own the land he tilled. A craftsman could master his trade and still owe rent to a landlord who did nothing but inherit property. Money flowed upward toward elites and states, not outward to workers. Economic mobility as we understand it today barely existed. You were born into a position. Your wealth was determined by what you controlled, and most people controlled nothing. Even when people were paid for work, it wasn't structured like modern employment. Wages were irregular, paid in goods as often as in coin, tied to harvests, seasons, or specific tasks. There was no concept of a steady income, no expectation that work would provide upward mobility. Work sustained you, control made you rich. It's easy to assume ancient states didn't tax their populations, or that taxation was simple and light. In reality, taxation existed long before income tax, and it was often far more invasive. The difference was how it was collected. Taxes were often paid in goods or labor, grain, livestock, metals, or compulsory work. In ancient Egypt, farmers paid taxes in grain. The state stored it in massive granaries and used it to feed workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. In Mesopotamia, temples collected taxes in the form of livestock, textiles, and agricultural produce. In medieval Europe, peasants owed labor to their lords, days of work each week on the lord's land, unpaid. This was called corvée labor. It was a tax paid in time, not money. In imperial China, households owed the state a portion of their harvest and a certain number of days of labor for public projects. This is how the Great Wall was built. This is how roads and canals were maintained. These resources funded armies, construction, and administration. The Roman legions that conquered Europe were fed by grain taxes collected from Egypt and North Africa. The cathedrals of medieval Europe were built with taxes collected from surrounding villages. Money was often secondary to resource control. A state didn't need coins to be powerful. It needed grain, it needed labor, it needed materials. If it could extract those directly from the population, it didn't need a monetary economy at all. This is why some of the most powerful ancient states operated with limited coinage. The Inca Empire, for example, didn't use money. It ran on a system of labor tax and state-controlled redistribution. Everyone owed work to the state. The state, in turn, provided for the population during famines or disasters. It was a command economy centuries before the Soviet Union. Taxation, in this sense, was more than just revenue collection. It was the mechanism through which the state organized society. And because most people didn't have money in any modern sense, they paid in the only currencies that mattered: food, materials, and time. While land and taxes created wealth for elites, long-distance trade transformed early economies. It opened up something that agricultural control couldn't: the possibility of extreme profit. Because goods that were common in one region could become extremely valuable in another. Silk was abundant in China, but in Rome it was worth more than gold. Spices like pepper and cinnamon grew in India and Southeast Asia. In Europe, they were luxury goods that only the wealthy could afford. Salt was so valuable in parts of Africa that it was traded weight for weight with gold. Those who controlled trade routes didn't need to create wealth, they redirected it. Think about the Silk Road. It stretched thousands of miles, crossing deserts, mountains, and empires. Merchants didn't travel the entire route. Instead, goods passed through many hands. Each middleman took a cut. Each city along the route charged taxes or tolls. By the time silk reached Rome, its price had multiplied dozens of times over. But no one cared because no one else had it. Scarcity created value. Distance created profit. This is how merchant elites rose to power. In Venice, merchant families controlled access to Eastern goods. They became so wealthy they could fund wars, commission art, and dominate politics. In the Hanseatic League, Northern European merchants formed a trade network so powerful it functioned almost like a state. They controlled ports, they negotiated treaties, they monopolized trade in timber, fish, grain, and fur. Wealth followed movement, not production. You didn't get rich by making things, you got rich by moving things from where they were cheap to where they were expensive. And the longer the distance, the greater the markup. This created a new kind of wealth, not tied to land, not tied to political office. Merchant wealth was mobile. It could be reinvested. It could compound. It's no coincidence that modern capitalism emerged in places with strong merchant classes. Italy, the Netherlands, England. These were societies where trade wealth was already concentrating, where merchants already had influence, where money was already starting to function as capital, wealth that generates more wealth. But even in these places, trade was constrained. It was dangerous, slow, heavily taxed. Ships could sink, caravans could be raided, ports could close. The wealth was enormous, but so was the risk. And that's part of why pre-capitalist economies moved so much more slowly than ours do today. Without banks and instant transactions, money moved slowly. A merchant in Venice couldn't wire funds to a supplier in Cairo. A king couldn't instantly devalue his currency to pay for a war. Information traveled poorly. News of a bad harvest in one region might take weeks or months to reach another. Prices adjusted slowly. Markets reacted slowly. Economic change took time. This slowness created stability. Inflation existed, but it spread gradually. When Spanish silver flooded Europe after the conquest of the Americas, prices did rise, but it took decades, not days. People adjusted. Wages eventually caught up. The economy recalibrated. Compare that to today, where a central bank announcement can move markets in seconds. Economic shocks unfolded over years, not days. A famine was a regional disaster, but it didn't immediately crash a global economy because there was no global economy. A war might disrupt trade routes, but alternative routes existed. Goods found other paths. The pre-capitalist economy was fragmented, localized, and resilient in ways ours is not. Of course, this stability came at a cost. Growth was slow, innovation was slow, social mobility was almost non-existent. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born into a merchant family, you might grow wealthy, but your wealth depended on connections, geography, and luck. There was no venture capital. No one was funding speculative startups. Wealth was inherited, seized, or slowly accumulated through trade. The economy didn't expand the way modern economies do. It cycled. Harvests were good or bad. Trade routes opened or closed. Empires rose and fell. But the fundamental structure stayed the same for centuries. Before modern capitalism, money was tangible, local, and controlled. It wasn't an abstraction in a database. It was grain in a storehouse, silver in a chest, land on a map. Wealth came from position, power, and access, not paychecks. You got rich by controlling resources, not by working hard. You maintained wealth by passing it down, not by earning a salary. Understanding this helps explain why wealth still concentrates today. Even in modern capitalism, wealth compounds fastest for those who already have it. Even in democratic societies, access to capital depends heavily on position and connections. The structures may have changed, but the patterns remain. And it helps explain why financial systems repeat familiar patterns: inflation, debt, speculation, crisis. These aren't new, they're ancient. The Romans debased their currency to pay for wars. Medieval kings defaulted on debts. Merchant bubbles burst in Amsterdam and London centuries before the stock market existed. History doesn't just tell us what happened, it explains how money really works, not as an abstract tool, but as a system of power, access, and control. And once you see that, you start to understand the economy you're living in right now. But if you're interested in learning how money worked in history to shape this modern economy, why not hit that like and subscribe button and join us here on Simple Financial Archives.